My name is Diane Vale, 31 years old. The day I stopped begging for approval didn't arrive with slammed doors or dramatic declarations. It slipped in quietly, like a draft under a locked window. But the beginning of that ending started much earlier, when I was 12 and a streak of violet taught me the rules of our house better than any lecture ever could. Back then, the Brooks family home, 4 bedrooms, 4 corners squared by expectation, breathed a single commandment: nothing grows wild here. In Ridgefield, our lawn was a diagram of obedience. The hedges were clipped to identical heights, the flower beds arranged in colors that matched the season, and, more importantly, the neighborhood board's sensibilities. Inside, Father, never Dad, always Father, wore suits whose creases were sharper than his smiles. Charles Brooks believed reputation was currency, and the Brooks name an investment account that should never be squandered. Mother, Eleanor to her friends, Mrs. Brooks to everyone else, chaired 3 committees and treated a charity gala like a military campaign. At dinner, she passed the peas with a pearl-clicking grace, and her laugh floated half an inch above the table, polite, hollow, perfectly on cue. The unwritten code settled into the plaster like a second coat of paint. What will people think? Governed everything from the cars we drove to the cereal we ate. My brothers, Derek and Lucas, were evidence that the code worked. Latin honors, varsity captains, ivy-bound trajectories. Their achievements hung on the mantelpiece like trophies, carefully dusted. I was the smudge on an otherwise gleaming portrait, the kid who sketched in the margins and asked questions that made the room fall silent. The violet hair was supposed to be temporary, a thin shock of color threaded through plain brown, a small rebellion I could rinse away before Monday. I did it in the upstairs bathroom with hands that trembled between exhilaration and terror, watching the purple bloom, a petal unrolling along my part. It made me feel like a secret I finally got to tell. When I bounded downstairs, the house smelled like roast beef and lemon polish. Father looked up from his newspaper. The shift in his face was instantaneous, weather changing on a single breath. "Absolutely not," he said, January cold. "Go wash that out immediately." "It's temporary," I pleaded. "It'll be gone by—" I said no. The paper snapped back into a fortress. "We're leaving for Derek's dinner in 30 minutes. You will not be joining us looking like that." "Charles," Mother murmured, the warning in her tone meant for me as much as him. "People will ask where she is." "Tell them she's ill," he answered without lowering the page. "Better they think she's sick than see her looking like that." There was no shouting, no theatrics, just a surgical excision, clean and practiced. I stood there with my brand new color, staining the light like a bruise, and felt the first stitch of the family myth unravel. Love here was a uniform. You dressed to belong. I scrubbed until my scalp burned and the violet turned into a murky echo. It didn't matter. The stain beneath the skin remained. Mother left me a sandwich on a small plate, no chips, no note, and air-kissed the doorframe as if affection were a room you could enter without touching anything. From my bedroom window, I watched them cross the driveway in a neat procession, silhouettes of correctness shrinking into the evening. Next door at the Petersons' kitchen, yellow light pooled on smiling faces. My family paused there, small talk. Father's hand on Derek's shoulder like a brand of merit, and I pressed my palm to the glass to steady the tilt of the room. I told myself I didn't care, but grief doesn't always howl. Sometimes it paces the perimeter, learning the shape of your life, waiting for a gap in the fence. The downstairs clock performed an autopsy on the silence. Tick, 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 until I understood the house wasn't quiet. It was listening. I put the sandwich back in the fridge uneaten, then walked to my desk and opened a cheap spiral notebook I'd hidden under a stack of math worksheets. I drew what I wasn't allowed to be, a small, stubborn flower pushing through a hairline crack in marble. I didn't know its name yet, didn't know I'd eventually etch foxglove into my skin and study nightshade with reverence. I only knew the line wanted to exist, and I wanted to follow it wherever it led. When they returned, Father smelled of cedar and success. Mother's perfume clung to the hall like a second language. Their voices slid around my door, calculated, curated. I learned then to translate tone better than words. Later, in the mirror, the last violet thread clung at my temple, a faint, disobedient gleam. I covered it with a headband and whispered, Maybe I'll have to draw my own family someday. It felt treasonous and true. The lessons multiplied after that, small humiliations accumulating like lint you're not supposed to notice. A youth group leader's compliment redirected to my brothers. A school art award Mother forgot to put on the fridge. The piano recital where I took a bow and Father checked his watch. Each moment a pinprick. Together a constellation spelling out, "Not enough, not like this." When I tried to speak about the ache, Father's phrase shut the door. "That's not up for discussion." My questions became sketches. My sketches became breath. At Sunday dinners, Mother's pearls tapped lightly against china as she delivered updates about committee minutes and who wore what to whose fundraiser. I'd trace the condensation on my water glass and imagine vines creeping up the table legs, fronds unfurling over linen, blossoms opening their mouths to sing something feral and true. Occasionally, Mother caught my hands, examined the graphite in my nail beds with distaste, and passed me a damp napkin held by 2 fingers. "For heaven's sake, Diane," she'd correct with a sigh, as if my name itself were a misstep. "Try to look presentable. People are watching." People were always watching, not me, the idea of me. I learned to chameleon my way through their rooms, nod on cue, fold opinions into thirds, and tuck them away. In private, I fed the part of me they forgot existed. My sketchbooks multiplied, under the bed, behind biology textbooks, in the space between mattress and box spring. The girls I drew stared back with unapologetic eyes and untamed hair, their throats an atlas of vines, their ribs a trellis. On the night of Derek's graduation dinner, the one I wasn't permitted to attend in Violet, our neighbor, Mrs. Avery, caught my eye across the hedge as she watered her garden. She tilted her head, the way you do when you're listening for a faraway sound. She didn't say anything, just offered the smallest nod, like a marker placed on a map. "I see you." It was not acceptance, not belonging, but it was a pin of truth pressed into the corkboard of my life. Later, that nod would glow in my memory like a lighthouse. At school, teachers praised my attention to detail. They didn't know detail was the only safe place to live. If you could replicate the exact transparency of a leaf, no one asked why your hands shook. If you could layer green upon green until it breathed, no one noticed you were holding yours. The first time I posted a drawing online, my heart beat so loudly I thought the floor would complain. A self-portrait emerging from brambles, a single bird on my shoulder. I called it Caged. By morning, there were comments. Some misspelled, some profound, all real. I pressed my palm against my mouth to keep the relief from making noise. Strangers saw me through the tangle and didn't look away. Back home, the machine kept humming. SAT practice, approved skirts, polite smiles. Father brought home a Dartmouth brochure and rested it beside my dessert, his eyes already sweeping me into the future he had picked out, like a clerk folding a sweater I never chose. "Economics is versatile," Mother said, which was her way of asking me to be useful, not myself. I nodded because that was the choreography. Later, upstairs, I traced the ivy on the brochure and sketched it cracking the college seal. Not out of malice, out of mercy. For the part of me that was suffocating under polite. I wish I could say I became brave in a single moment. It didn't happen like that. Courage arrived in shy increments. A mail slot whispering the first art school email. Mrs. Avery's nod, my own reflection, smudged with graphite, refusing to apologize. It was a series of almosts, a trail of violet crumbs leading me out of a forest where every tree wore a necktie. That night at 12, alone in my room with a sandwich curling at the edges downstairs, I drew until my wrist ached. The flower pushing up through marble bent toward an invisible sun. I didn't have a name for what I was choosing, but I felt its pulse, steady under the noise. And somewhere below the floorboards, below Father's polished shoes and Mother's perfumed script, something wild put down a root. I would not understand for years that the opposite of approval is not rejection. It's freedom. The kind that slips under your window and waits, patient as dawn, for you to open it. When I turned 16, I learned that rebellion doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it's just silence that refuses to apologize. By then, my bedroom had become both studio and sanctuary. Sketchbooks were stacked under my bed, stashed behind old sweaters in the closet, hidden in the space between mattress and box spring. My fingers were perpetually smudged with graphite, the ridges darkened by charcoal dust. At school, it made me look distracted, a girl too lost in her own head. At home, it made me look dirty, which was worse. Mother noticed one evening over Sunday dinner. Her pearl necklace gleamed like armor as she leaned forward, squinting at my hands. "For heaven's sake, Diane, what have you been doing?" "Drawing," I said. "Drawing?" She passed me a napkin held delicately between two fingers, as though the sight itself contaminated her. "Well, wash up before dessert. Pastor Mitchell might stop by tonight." I didn't move. He's seen hands before. Not hands that look like that. Father's fork paused midway to his mouth. "Listen to your mother." His tone wasn't angry. It didn't need to be. It was the sound of a rule already written. I nodded, excused myself, and scrubbed until the water ran gray. When I returned, the skin was raw, and no one mentioned it again. After that night, I learned to draw at hours when the house was asleep. The rhythmic creak of the furnace covered the scrape of my pencil. I'd sit cross-legged by the window, sketching the skeletal outlines of trees under the streetlight. The branches always seemed to reach for something they could never touch. One of my online friends, Arden, messaged me through an art forum. "Your lines feel like they're searching for air." I stared at the message for a long time. It was the first time anyone had described what I'd been doing instead of just what it looked like. I replied, "Maybe they're trying to breathe." Arden lived somewhere across the country, Wisconsin, I think, but our messages became my real diary. We sent sketches back and forth, traded critiques, joked about the art teachers who didn't understand us. I never told Arden about my family. I didn't need to. The silence between our words understood it for me. By junior year, I'd started sneaking into the library's computer lab after school to scan my drawings and upload them to the forum. The thrill of seeing comments from strangers, people who saw me, was addictive. "Your style reminds me of old botanical studies," one wrote. "There's emotion in your stems," said another. I printed those comments and folded them into my journal like pressed flowers. At home, the Brooks routine continued as though my secret world didn't exist. Derek's college acceptance letters arrived first, followed by Lucas's debate trophies. They lined the mantel like an honor guard. At dinner, Father talked about legacy, while Mother nodded and refilled his wine glass. When the subject of my future came up, Father cleared his throat and slid a brochure across the table. "Dartmouth has an excellent economics program." I traced the embossed crest on the cover. "I'm applying somewhere else." Mother's fork clattered against her plate. "Excuse me?" "Art schools," I said. The words felt both terrifying and true. Across the country. San Francisco, maybe. Father's laugh was quiet, humorless. "You're joking." I wasn't. I'd already submitted 7 applications, portfolio included, using the savings from selling small commissions online. He didn't know I had a bank account in my own name. "That's not a real path," he said. "It's a hobby." "It's mine," I answered. The silence afterward felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Then he dismissed me with a flick of his hand. "We'll discuss this when you're ready to be reasonable." That night, I sat on the floor beside my bed, sketchbook open, heart pounding. I drew until the page filled with wild plants sprouting from cracks in concrete. In the corner, I wrote one sentence. "They can't cut what they can't find." A month later, the acceptance letter came. San Francisco Art and Design Institute, 75% scholarship. I hid it in my sock drawer, reading it in secret every night like a prayer. Meanwhile, Mother paraded me through country club luncheons, introducing me as our youngest, still deciding what she wants to do. The women in pastel cardigans would smile with practiced interest. "Art therapy, perhaps?" they'd suggest, meaning safe. One afternoon, as I stood beside the dessert table at one of her luncheons, I overheard Mother's voice drift through the chatter. "Diane has always been creative," she said, the pause between words a polite apology. "We just hope she channels it productively." I left before dessert was served. At home, I found her pearl earrings on the vanity and placed them on top of my sketchbook, as if to say, "You don't have to wear them to be seen." The next few weeks blurred into a rhythm of secrecy and hope. Every morning before school, I checked the mailbox early, just in case another letter arrived. Every night, I drew until my fingers cramped. Each page became less about what I wanted to escape and more about where I wanted to go. Spring brought the first crack in Father's certainty. He received a call from Dartmouth, confirming they had never received my application. He confronted me in the living room, the brochure crumpled in his fist. "What have you done?" "Something honest," I said, "something mine." The conversation exploded from there. His voice thundered through the house while Mother cried softly into a napkin. I stood very still and let their words rush around me like weather. When they were done, I simply said, "I'm going." Later that night, I slipped out into the backyard. The manicured grass was damp under my bare feet, the air humming with crickets. I looked at the house, the perfect symmetry of it, and knew it would never see me as anything but a flaw in the pattern. Somewhere behind a lit window, Mother's shadow passed, smoothing the curtains. Father's silhouette remained rigid in his study, jaw outlined against the glow of his desk lamp. I whispered to the darkness, "You can't erase me." It wasn't defiance yet, not fully, more like a sketch of it, the faint outline of a future still taking shape. But I felt it, the pulse of something that refused to disappear. The next morning, I mailed my acceptance form. No one saw me do it. No one ever would understand how much of myself fit into that small envelope. That night, before bed, I logged into the forum and messaged Arden. I got in. A minute later, their reply appeared. "Then go paint your life. Don't let them decide the colors." I smiled, closed my laptop, and pressed my palm to the wall between my room and my parents'. The wallpaper felt cool and still. In my head, I drew a line from my room to the bus station 3 towns over, a route out of symmetry and into uncertainty. For the first time, uncertainty didn't scare me. It looked like freedom dressed in violet. When the acceptance letter from the San Francisco Art and Design Institute arrived, I almost didn't open it. The envelope looked too official, too heavy with possibility. My hand shook as I tore it open and read the words that would change everything. "We are pleased to offer you admission with a 75% scholarship." For 3 days, I hid it under my pillow like a secret I wasn't ready to believe. Every night before bed, I took it out, ran my fingers over the embossed crest, and whispered the words again. Accepted. Scholarship. September. The syllables felt like a heartbeat that finally belonged to me. I'd planned how I would tell them. I imagined a version of that conversation where my father looked proud and my mother teared up just a little. But even in those fantasies, their faces stayed stiff with disbelief. So when the real moment came, it didn't surprise me how quickly the air turned to glass. It was a Friday evening. Father was home early, which usually meant good news for him and bad news for everyone else. He'd just won a high-profile tax case, and his voice carried the weight of victory as he poured himself a scotch. Mother sat beside him on the cream sofa, polishing her pearl earrings with a tissue, her idea of relaxation. I placed the letter carefully on the coffee table between us. "I got in," I said. Father glanced at the envelope, then at me. "Into what?" "Art school, the San Francisco Art and Design Institute. They offered me a scholarship." For a moment, no one breathed. Then the scotch glass touched the table with a deliberate click. "You're joking," he said. "It's real," I replied. 3/4 of tuition covered. I'll find a part-time job for the rest." Mother's hand froze mid-polish. "San Francisco?" she repeated, the name like something sour. "That's 3,000 miles away." "Exactly." It slipped out before I could stop it. Father's expression darkened. "Diane, we've already discussed Dartmouth." "No," I said quietly, "you discussed it." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Then the explosion came. He shouted about irresponsibility, wasted potential, how no one makes a living by drawing pictures. Mother cried softly into her tissue, the pearls trembling in her hand. Every word hit me like a wave I'd already learned to stand against. When they finally ran out of breath, I picked up the letter again and said, "You don't have to pay for it. I earned this. I'm going." The sound of Father's glass shattering against the hearth should have scared me. Instead, it sounded like music, the kind that plays when something old finally breaks. That night, I packed in silence. A single suitcase for clothes, another for my portfolio and sketchbooks. The letter stayed in my jacket pocket, folded carefully, a paper shield against the storm I'd unleashed. Mother came to my room once. She stood in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the hall light. "You're making a mistake," she whispered. "Maybe," I said, "but it's mine to make." Her breath caught, but she didn't argue. When the front door closed behind me the next morning, it sounded final. No one followed. No one said goodbye. At the bus station, I watched the sun rise through the glass roof. The air smelled like diesel and rain. For a brief moment, I almost turned back, until a child across the aisle began drawing on the fogged window with her finger. A heart, crooked but alive. I smiled. The bus arrived, brakes hissing like a sigh. I climbed aboard. As Ridgefield disappeared behind me, I pressed my forehead to the window. Each mile peeled away another layer of expectation. By the time the New York skyline flickered into view, I felt lighter than I'd ever been. No pearls, no rules, just the hum of the engine and the pulse of possibility. The journey took 3 days. Pittsburgh, Denver, then the long stretch toward California. I slept little, surviving on vending machine coffee and the quiet thrill of escape. Somewhere in the Nevada desert, I opened my sketchbook and drew what I saw: endless space. It wasn't beautiful or symmetrical. It was raw, imperfect, alive. Exactly what I wanted to be. When the bus finally curved around the bay and I saw the city rising from the fog, it felt like the first breath after years underwater. San Francisco gleamed like an unfinished painting, brushstrokes of gold, gray, and sea blue mist. The dorm smelled of paint, coffee, and ambition. My roommate, Zoe, was the opposite of everyone I'd ever known: barefoot, tattooed, and utterly unfiltered. She studied music composition and spoken rhythms. "You look like you've been holding your breath for 18 years, she said that first night. Maybe I have. The next morning, I walked into my first class, Foundations of Design, and felt like I'd stepped into a new language. Our professor, a silver-haired woman named Winters, examined my sketchbook after class. "These are precise," she said, flipping through pages of botanical studies. "Too precise." I frowned. "Too precise?" She tapped one drawing, a vine coiled around a cracked teacup. "There's emotion in your control, but I don't feel you yet. Where are you hiding?" I didn't know how to answer. I'd spent so long erasing myself that I wasn't sure there was anything left to reveal. But that night, her words followed me into sleep, looping through dreams of roots breaking through pavement. On Saturday, Zoe dragged me to a tattoo studio in the Mission District. "Art should live," she said. The place smelled of antiseptic and metal. The artist, Morgan, was covered in intricate designs: dragons twining around peonies, galaxies spiraling across her shoulders. "What do you want?" she asked. I unfolded a small sketch I'd drawn on the bus, a single foxglove stem curling up the forearm. "Foxglove," I explained. "Poisonous in the wrong hands, medicine in the right." Morgan smiled. "Perfect." The needle bit into my skin, and I almost cried. Not from pain, but from the strange relief of permanence. Every vibration sang, "Mine, mine, mine." When it was over, Morgan handed me a mirror. "There," she said. "You've just drawn yourself into the world." I looked at the violet blooms winding up my arm, and for the first time, I didn't feel like something to be hidden. When I returned to class on Monday, I wore short sleeves. Professor Winters noticed immediately. Her eyes flicked to the fresh tattoo, then back to my face. "Now we're getting somewhere," she said softly. That week, I filled an entire sketchbook with color. No outlines, no rules, just wild growth. Every petal, every thorn, a declaration of existence. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need permission to be seen. By the time my first year ended, the city had already begun to change me. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in layers, like paint building depth on a canvas. The fog that rolled in each morning felt less like mystery and more like permission, a soft gray curtain that let me breathe unseen until I was ready to step forward. Art school wasn't what I expected. It wasn't all inspiration and late-night genius. It was critique boards, sleepless nights, spilled ink, and brutal honesty that stripped away every illusion I'd brought from Connecticut. Professor Winters, who terrified half the class, became my compass. She had eyes that could spot falseness the way some people smelled smoke. "You're still trying to please someone," she said once, squinting at a piece I'd worked on for weeks. A perfect, lifeless study of a lily. "Who is it?" I didn't answer, but we both knew. That night, I painted over the lily in black, then layered it with crimson strokes until it resembled a heartbreaking open. When I pinned it up the next morning, she smiled faintly. "Now that," she said, "is truth." It wasn't long before my work began to turn heads. Students stopped by my easel to watch the delicate lines of my botanical studies grow into something darker, petals curling like secrets, stems twisting like trapped emotion. I learned to find beauty in asymmetry, strength in imperfection. And somehow, through the rhythm of my hand and the hum of the tattoo machines that buzzed from the shop across the street, I began to understand what art could do beyond paper. Zoe, my roommate, was the first to say it out loud. "You should tattoo," she declared one Friday as we sat on the dorm floor, surrounded by half-finished canvases. "You already draw on everything else." I laughed it off, but the idea clung to me like wet paint. Tattooing was permanent, unforgiving, intimate. It demanded both precision and courage, the two things I'd been told to suppress. When I walked into Iron and Ivy that summer to ask about an apprenticeship, I thought my voice might crack from fear. Rachel West, the owner, didn't even look up at first. She was wiping down her workstation, sleeves rolled, to reveal her own garden of ink, ferns, thistles, and a single black rose that disappeared under her elbow. When she finally met my eyes, her expression softened. "You're an artist," she said simply. "I can tell." She flipped through my portfolio in silence, pausing on the page where I'd drawn foxglove curling around a rib cage. Her thumb brushed the paper. "This," she murmured. "You understand that beauty can hurt." I nodded. "I think it's the only kind that's honest." She smiled. "You start Monday." Those first weeks were humbling. I swept floors, sterilized tools, mixed inks until my fingers were stained like bruises. When Rachel let me shadow her appointments, I watched the sacred exchange between artist and client. The trust, the stillness, the stories that spilled out while the needle hummed. A widow getting her late husband's initials hidden inside a vine. A cancer survivor covering the scar on her chest with magnolias. A shy teenage boy immortalizing his late mother's handwriting along his forearm. "People think we decorate skin," Rachel said one night while locking up. "We don't. We translate pain." By the end of my apprenticeship, I'd begun to understand what she meant. My own designs, plants and bones, tenderness and decay, started appearing on real bodies. Each one felt like a quiet miracle. Every session began with fear and ended with freedom. The first time I tattooed someone alone, my hands trembled. It was a woman in her 60s who wanted lilacs climbing her shoulder. "Why lilacs?" I asked as I prepped the stencil. She smiled sadly. "My mother grew them. When she died, I couldn't stand to see them bloom without her. Now I want to carry them with me." As the needle buzzed, she told me stories of summers and loss, of scent and memory. When I finished, she looked in the mirror, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She'd love this," she whispered. I didn't realize I was crying too until Rachel handed me a tissue. That night, I understood something my parents never could. Love doesn't need to be perfect to be permanent. Over time, the studio became more than a workplace. It became home. Rachel taught me how to breathe through the hum of the machine, how to balance patience with precision. Under her guidance, my designs evolved, botanical motifs intertwined with human anatomy, life and death woven into every line. My waiting list grew. People came not just for ink, but for connection. They came to be seen. Meanwhile, my real family faded into background noise. Mother sent brief, formal emails, holiday greetings that could have been copy-pasted. Father sent none. The distance that once hurt began to feel like relief. Their silence was space, and in that space, I bloomed. One evening, as I locked up the shop, Rachel called me into her office. Her desk was cluttered with invoices, ink bottles, and a single mug that read, "Don't tell me to smile." She didn't waste time. "I'm opening a second location," she said. "I need someone I trust to take over this one." I blinked. "You mean—" She slid a folder across the desk. "Partnership papers. 51% me, 49% you. For now." I stared at the document, the numbers blurring. "Why me?" Rachel leaned back in her chair, studying me. "Because you don't just draw on skin," she said. "You listen. You see people the way you wish your family had seen you." The words hit harder than I expected. I swallowed, nodding. "When do I sign?" She smiled. "You already did, the moment you started showing up like this place mattered." I left that night with the city lights flickering through the drizzle, the folder tucked under my arm, and a certainty pulsing beneath my skin. For the first time in my life, someone had chosen me not because of my potential, but because of my presence. When I got home, Zoe was sprawled on the couch, headphones around her neck. I held up the folder. "I'm a partner," I said, grinning. She whooped, leaping up to hug me. "You did it, Vale. You finally inked yourself into the world." We celebrated with cheap champagne and takeout pizza, laughing until the walls echoed. Later, when she fell asleep mid-song, I stepped out onto the fire escape. The air smelled like rain and ink and freedom. I looked down at my arms, the flowers, the vines, the foxglove, and whispered, "You did it." For years, I'd been told that permanence was dangerous, that identity should be hidden, that color was chaos. But under the city's silver fog, I'd learned something else. Color wasn't chaos. It was life insisting on being seen. Success has a way of echoing differently, depending on who's listening. In Portland, my name began to mean something. Clients came from other states for my botanical work. Magazines called it emotion etched in ink. But in Connecticut, to the people who raised me, it was still a hobby I'd eventually outgrow. The proof arrived one Thursday afternoon in a white envelope, thick, perfumed, with gold-embossed lettering. "The honor of your presence is requested at the wedding of Derek Brooks and Caroline Montgomery." Below that, neat cursive from Mother. "We hope you'll join us for this special family occasion. Please wear neutral colors, long sleeves preferred. Avoid bright hair tones for photographs." I laughed out loud, startling my apprentice. "Guess I'm still a scandal," I said. That night, Rachel caught me staring at the invitation in the break room. "Family news?" she asked. "Something like that," I replied, handing it to her. She read it once, then looked up. "Are you going?" "I don't know." I traced the edge of the paper. Part of me wants to show up exactly as I am. Another part... I hesitated. Another part still wants to belong. Rachel studied me for a moment, then said quietly, "You already do, just not there." I didn't answer. A week later, I booked the flight. At the boutique, I held up 2 dresses, one beige, one silver. Beige whispered, "They'll leave you alone if you pretend to be invisible." Silver said, "You exist whether they approve or not." I chose silver. The morning of the wedding, the air in Connecticut felt thicker, heavier, the kind of humidity that makes pearls stick to your skin. The Brooks family home hadn't changed. The lawn was still perfect. The windows still mirrored the sky so well you couldn't see inside. When I arrived at the church, Mother met me at the door. She looked immaculate, hair pinned, perfume familiar enough to ache. "Diane," she said, her smile tight. "How nice of you to come. You look..." Her eyes flicked over my tattoos. "Different." "Thanks," I said. Her gaze lingered on the silver dress before she whispered, "We've arranged seating in the back row, dear, near the musicians." "Of course you have." The ceremony was beautiful, I'll give them that. White roses everywhere, a string quartet playing something elegant and cold. When the photographer lined everyone up for pictures, I was gently guided toward the edge of the frame. "Just here," the coordinator murmured. "Behind your cousin Thomas. Perfect." He was taller than me, by a head. In most of the photos, I disappeared completely. At the reception, my table was near the kitchen doors. Waiters brushed past with trays of champagne, and every so often someone from the family would stop by long enough to say, "So good to see you, Diane," without waiting for an answer. When Father found me, he looked exactly as I remembered. Crisp suit, commanding posture, voice like a gavel. "Your work," he said, as if testing the word, "is doing well, I hear." "It is." "Good. Perhaps now you'll consider something more traditional, a design firm, maybe?" I smiled faintly. I already run one. He didn't respond, just nodded once, dismissively, as if I'd passed a test he'd forgotten to grade. Later, when the first dance began, I slipped outside. The music drifted through the open doors. Polished, perfect, sterile. The night air was cooler. The moonlight turned the manicured hedges silver. I lit a cigarette even though I hadn't smoked in years, just to have something to hold. Inside, laughter rose and fell like waves I was never meant to swim in. A sudden sound made me turn. Lucas, my middle brother, stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets. "You came," he said softly. "So did you," I replied. He smiled at that, a small, weary smile. "You look happy." I raised an eyebrow. "You sound surprised." He shrugged. "You always wanted different things. I guess you found them." I did. There was a pause, long and uneasy, before he said, "They'll never understand, you know." "I know," I said, "but I stopped asking them to." He nodded, then walked back inside. I stayed there until the music faded. When the lights from the reception hall began to dim, I realized no one had noticed I was gone. At the hotel that night, I stood before the bathroom mirror, makeup half washed, hair falling loose, and studied my reflection. Under the harsh fluorescent light, I didn't look like the daughter they'd wanted or the rebel they feared. I just looked like me, silver dress, inked skin, tired eyes, and all. I wiped the last traces of foundation away, exposing the small foxglove tattoo on my forearm. Its violet petals caught the light. "Still poisonous," I whispered, smiling. Back in Portland a week later, I unpacked the silver dress and hung it at the back of my closet. Not as a trophy, not as defiance, just as proof. Proof that I could walk into the past, survive it, and leave again without losing myself. That evening, Rachel handed me the day's mail, another invitation, this time with new handwriting. "Lucas Brooks and Vanessa Hayes request the honor of your presence." I didn't need to read the rest to know. The note tucked inside read, "The Four Seasons Boston maintains a strict dress code. No visible tattoos permitted. Please plan accordingly." I stared at it until the words blurred. Then I picked up my phone and typed a message. "To Lucas. I won't be attending. Congratulations to you both." A moment later, my phone rang. "Diane, come on," he said. "It's my wedding." "I know, but it's also my skin." "You could cover them just for a day." "Could you?" I asked quietly. He said nothing. "I'm proud of you," I told him before hanging up. "Really, but I'm done being a secret." That night, I sat by my studio window, the city alive below me, and realized something simple and devastating. All these years, I'd been waiting for permission to belong. But belonging isn't granted, it's created. And I was already home. Holidays used to feel like reminders of everything I'd lost. Thanksgiving, Christmas, even my birthday. Each one a quiet ache punctuated by the absence of phone calls that never came. But that first year, after saying no to my brother's wedding, something changed. Zoe texted one morning in November, "Orphan Thanksgiving at my place. Bring whatever doesn't scare the health department." I almost said no. Then I realized that the word orphan didn't sting anymore. It sounded oddly freeing. Zoe's loft smelled like cinnamon and burnt stuffing. 23 people crowded the space. Artists, musicians, baristas, one retired librarian who'd wandered in from the building next door. There were no assigned seats, no hushed toasts, no judgment about hair color or table manners, just laughter and warmth. I sat between Fiona, who built sculptures from discarded electronics, and Marcus, a gallery owner with paint-stained jeans. Halfway through dinner, Fiona looked at me and said, "You're quieter than I expected." I smiled. "Old habit." "Bad habit," Marcus replied. "Around here, silence means you're out of wine." He poured me another glass without asking. It was that kind of night, loud, chaotic, unfiltered. And for the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider trying to prove I belonged. I was simply there. After dessert, someone pulled out a violin, another person started drumming on the countertop, and the music rose until the walls themselves seemed to hum. Zoe raised her glass. "To the families we build," she said. "To the ones who see us as we are." Glasses clinked. Laughter echoed. I thought of my mother's perfect table settings, the quiet choreography of control, and I realized that what I'd always wanted was this: messy, imperfect, alive. Christmas came next. We decorated a thrift store tree with miniature art pieces, tiny canvases, clay ornaments, scribbled poems folded into stars. Our gifts were handmade or secondhand. Someone gave me a box of mismatched teacups. Zoe gave me a mug that said, "Ink runs thicker than blood." We laughed until we cried. And then in March, I met Caleb. It was raining the night of the Evergreen Gallery's spring showcase. I stood beside my latest piece, a tattoo design transferred to canvas, when he appeared. Tall, dark curls damp from the drizzle, camera slung across his chest like an old friend. "The texture here," he said, stepping closer to examine my work. "It's honest. You captured something raw." Most people commented on detail or color, but honest, that was different. "Thank you," I said. "I try to make my art tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." He smiled. "Then we have that in common." He introduced himself. Caleb Reed, documentary photographer. He'd been traveling through the Pacific Northwest capturing stories of artists who lived outside the lines. That night, we talked until the gallery closed, about ink and lenses, rebellion and belonging, the strange ache of freedom. When he asked if I wanted to grab coffee, I said yes, without hesitation. The cafe was nearly empty, the smell of espresso blending with the rain. He asked about my work, not in the polite way people do, but as if he actually wanted to understand. What made you start tattooing? I thought for a moment. Because it's the one art form that doesn't let you hide. Once it's there, forever. He nodded slowly. I photograph people for the same reason. The camera never lies, it just waits for you to stop pretending. That line stayed with me. Over the next few months, Caleb became part of my world, first quietly, then all at once. He'd stop by Iron and Ivy with coffee and a smile, watching from the corner as I worked. Sometimes he photographed the process, the concentration, the closeness, the small tremors of transformation. He never made it about himself. He just observed, steady and present. When he met Zoe and Marcus, they liked him immediately. He fits, Zoe said later, grinning. No adjustment period. That's rare. It was. I dated before. Men who said they admired my independence but flinched when they realized it meant I didn't need saving. Caleb was different. He didn't fill silence with explanations. He didn't compete with my art. He wanted to understand it. Our first kiss happened late one evening in the studio. The machines were off, the lights dim, and I was cleaning my station when he brushed a stray hair from my face. You know, he said softly, you paint with ink, and I paint with light. Maybe that's why we found each other. Then he kissed me, gentle, unhurried, grounding. The kind of kiss that felt less like a spark and more like recognition. Weeks turned into months. We spent weekends exploring the Oregon coast, taking photographs and sketches that blurred into shared art projects. He introduced me to his parents, two kind, eccentric teachers who lived in a house filled with books and laughter. They welcomed me instantly, no questions, no conditions. It was disorienting in the best possible way. One evening, as we cooked dinner together, Caleb asked, "Do you ever miss them? Your family?" I stirred the sauce, thinking carefully. "I miss the idea of them," I said. "The version I thought I could earn if I behaved perfectly." He nodded, silent for a while. Then, "Maybe family isn't something you find. Maybe it's something you make, one person at a time." That night, lying beside him, I realized I'd stopped looking backward. Our love didn't feel like escape. It felt like arrival. There were no rules, no negotiations about who I was allowed to be. He saw me exactly as I was, scars, ink, mess, and all. When he photographed me for a project called Reclamation, he asked if I'd pose with my tattoos visible. "Are you sure?" I asked. "It's not exactly family-friendly." He smiled. "It's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be real." The photo later became the centerpiece of his exhibition. Me, back to the camera, my spine tattoo catching the golden light, the words, "My story, my skin," barely visible across my shoulders. I didn't realize how much it meant to him until the opening night, when he turned to me and said, "You don't just survive your past, Diane. You turn it into art." It was the first time I believed it. Months passed in a rhythm of creation and quiet joy. We worked, we argued about nothing, we built something that felt unshakable. Zoe joked that we were disgustingly compatible. Maybe we were. Then, on a rainy evening in May, Caleb handed me a small wooden box carved with floral patterns. Inside was a silver ring shaped like a wildflower pushing through cracked concrete, the same image as my first tattoo. "The first time you told me about that design," he said, "you said it meant resilience, beauty through damage. That's what I see when I look at you." The world seemed to still around us. When he asked, "Will you marry me?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said, 1,000 times yes. And for the first time in my life, the word family didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a promise. The morning after Caleb proposed, sunlight spilled across our apartment floor like a benediction. I watched the ring glint against my skin, the tiny silver wildflower catching the light, and thought, so this is what it feels like to be chosen for who you are, not who you pretend to be. We didn't plan anything extravagant. No Pinterest boards, no guest lists dictated by guilt, just the two of us sketching ideas on napkins, a rooftop garden, string lights, the city skyline glowing behind us. Every detail was a reflection of us, raw, unpolished, real. Still, one question lingered like smoke. "Are you going to tell them?" Caleb asked gently one night, tracing the outline of the foxglove tattoo on my arm. "I should," I said, though my voice betrayed uncertainty. One last chance for them to see me. The next morning, I sent an email. "Caleb and I are engaged. We're planning a small ceremony in Portland this fall. We'd love for you to be part of this new chapter of our lives. I hovered over the send button for a long moment before pressing it. The sound of it whooshing away felt too small for what it meant. Their response arrived hours later. So efficient it almost felt rehearsed. Mother first. We would, of course, like to meet this young man before giving our blessing. Perhaps you could both visit Ridgefield soon. Then Father. Congratulations. Will you be toning things down for the photos? I read it twice, then shut my laptop. There it was again, the condition hidden inside every sentiment. Approval with an asterisk. When Caleb came home, I handed him the tablet. They want to meet you, I said flatly, or evaluate you, hard to tell the difference. He read in silence, jaw tightening slightly. Then he asked, "What do you want?" The question landed heavier than I expected. No one had ever asked me that without an agenda attached. "I want to stop performing," I said finally. "Then don't," he replied simply. Over the next few weeks, the pressure mounted. Mother called with suggestions about attire, pastel dresses that wouldn't clash with my hair, photographers who specialized in classic portraits. Father emailed spreadsheets for budgeting, as if control could masquerade as generosity. Their words carried the same polished poison I'd grown up swallowing. "We'll help you, as long as you let us reshape you first." When they insisted we visit Connecticut before the wedding, I felt the old ache rise again. But this time, something stronger pushed back. "They're treating this like a job interview," I told Caleb, pacing our living room. "They'll dissect you, the tattoos, the art, the way you talk." "I can handle scrutiny," he said calmly, "but you shouldn't have to." His steadiness anchored me. For the first time, I realized I didn't owe anyone access to my peace. "I don't want them there," I said, and even as I spoke the words, relief flooded through me. Caleb smiled. "Then we'll build this day our way." And so we did. Our wedding wasn't grand, but it was alive. A rooftop garden overlooking the Willamette River, autumn air crisp with promise. String lights looped between iron beams, casting halos on the crowd of people who had become my real family. Zoe, Marcus, Fiona, Rachel, and 100 others who had seen every shade of me and stayed. I walked down the aisle alone, not because there was no one to give me away, but because I'd already reclaimed everything they ever took. The guests rose, faces shining with love instead of judgment. Caleb stood beneath an arch woven with ivy and copper wire sculptures our friends had made. When he saw me, his eyes filled instantly. "You are everything," he whispered when I reached him. Marcus, who officiated the ceremony, smiled. "We gather today not to witness the beginning of a relationship, but to celebrate a bond already proven." Our vows were simple. No promises of obedience or perfection, just honesty. Caleb's voice shook slightly as he spoke. "I promise never to ask you to shrink so I can feel taller. Your wildness is why I fell in love with you." When it was my turn, I said, "I choose you as you are, whole, unfinished, beautiful. I don't need to complete you. I just want to walk beside you." Someone sniffled us a crowd. Zoe cheered. We laughed. It was perfect. When I almost dropped the ring, Marcus quipped, "Artists, precise with ink, clumsy with jewelry," and everyone burst into laughter. It was exactly the kind of imperfection I'd always feared, and it felt like home. As we kissed beneath the copper lights, the city roared below, a symphony of traffic and life. For once, I didn't feel like an outsider looking in. I belonged. To myself, to him, to this. The reception glowed with movement. Instead of stiff dinner service, food stations lined the terrace. Tacos, noodles, desserts piled high. Caleb's photographs hung on one wall. My tattoo designs filled another. In the center was a small booth where guests could get tiny commemorative tattoos. A heart, a vine, a wildflower. Vince, one of our artist friends, manned the station. By midnight, even Fiona had one on her wrist. "Your father would faint," Rachel joked, handing me a glass of champagne. I grinned. "That's half the fun." Everywhere I looked, I saw love unfiltered. Laughter, paint, ink, music. It was chaotic and real and gloriously human. Near the end of the night, Caleb found me standing by the railing, city lights reflecting in his eyes. "How does it feel to be Mrs. Reed?" he teased. "Still feels like Diane Vale," I said. "And that's the point." He laughed softly. "Good. I wouldn't have it any other way." We danced until our feet ached. No rehearsed choreography, just rhythm and joy. When we finally left, shoes in hand, dawn brushed the sky in pale gold. We walked home barefoot, hand in hand, two people who had stopped asking for permission to exist. 2 weeks later, the doorbell rang. Caleb was editing photos in the living room. I was painting in the studio. He answered, and the silence that followed made me set down my brush. When I stepped into the hallway, I saw them. Father, mother. Behind them, Derek and Lucas standing stiff and uncomfortable in the doorway of the life I'd built without them. Delaney, Diane, father said, correcting himself awkwardly. May we come in? I hesitated, then I nodded. They entered cautiously, eyes darting across the plants, the canvases, the framed tattoo photos lining the walls. My mother's pearls gleamed like small moons against her throat. They looked wildly out of place. We received this, father began, holding up a newspaper clipping, a photo from the Oregonian, Caleb and me, at our wedding, laughter mid-motion. Do you understand how humiliating it was to learn about your wedding from strangers? He said sharply. To have people asking why we weren't there? Mother's voice followed, brittle. The Hendersons' daughter saw it online, at the luncheon. Her tone carried that same old ache, not of loss, but of reputation. I met her gaze steadily. Did you expect an invitation? We're your family, she said, as if that word were armor. Caleb's hand found mine. He didn't speak, but his presence said everything. You know what's embarrassing? I said quietly. Spending 30 years pretending to be someone else just to make other people comfortable. Mother flinched. Father's jaw tightened. But I didn't stop. You're not upset about missing my wedding, I said. You're upset that people noticed you weren't there. I walked to the door and opened it. I have a family now, one that doesn't require performance or permission. They didn't argue. They just stood there, silent, immaculate, irrelevant. As they stepped into the hall, Mother turned back once, eyes shining with something that might have been sorrow, or maybe just pride's final defense. When the door clicked shut, the quiet that followed wasn't emptiness. It was peace. Caleb wrapped his arms around me. You okay? He asked softly. I leaned against his shoulder. For the first time, I said, yes. 3 months passed after the visit, and their absence felt like air returning to a sealed room. No more emails, no more clipped calls that sounded like board meetings. Just silence. Clean, uncomplicated silence. I used it well. In that time, I poured everything I couldn't say into art. My new studio smelled of eucalyptus oil and fresh paint. On one wall, I hung a sign hand-carved by Marcus, Ember Ink Collective. Underneath, in smaller letters, Art that heals. It wasn't just a tattoo studio anymore. It was a sanctuary for people whose bodies carried stories they'd been told to hide. Rachel retired and left me the original iron and ivy lease, trusting me to rebuild it in my own way. I kept the bones of the space, the wide windows, the smell of antiseptic and ink, but added warmth, mint green walls, soft lights, shelves of plants reaching toward sunlight. No mirrors except one for final reveals. My first client under the new sign was a woman named Parker, 39 years old, newly divorced. She wanted a butterfly emerging from shards of glass. My mother always said tattoos were for people with no future, she confessed, voice shaking slightly. Maybe she was right. But right now, I just need something that's mine. As the needle hummed, her words echoed pieces of my own story. When we finished, she stared at the mirror, eyes wide, tears beginning to gather. It's perfect, she whispered. It feels like freedom. Then it's doing its job, I said softly. Moments like that reminded me why I stayed. Every session was more than ink. It was reclamation. Each scar, each design, a declaration. I survived. One evening, while I was closing up, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Then a message. Can we talk? Coffee sometime? Lucas. I stared at it for a long time, the words blurring like a reflection in water. My first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity, gentle, cautious, nudged me forward. 3 days later, we met at a small cafe halfway between our homes. He looked older, softer somehow. No tailored suit, no practiced smile. When he saw me, his eyes brightened with something that almost looked like relief. You look good, he said carefully. So do you, I replied, though his hair was thinning at the temples and his posture carried a quiet weight. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup like it might steady him. Jenny's pregnant, he said. 4 months. Congratulations, I said, meaning it. He nodded. It's making me think about things, about the kind of parent I want to be, and the kind of brother I haven't been. I didn't interrupt. He took a breath. I'm sorry, he said finally. For not standing up for you, for pretending not to notice when they hurt you, for caring more about Dad's approval than your feelings. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Apologies had always been foreign currency in our family, rare and never without interest. But this one felt different, genuine, costly. I'm not asking you to forget, he continued. I just don't want my child to grow up thinking love has to be earned. The cafe noise dimmed. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the golden sun, but a man trying to unlearn the language of control. I appreciate that, I said. Truly, but there have to be boundaries. He nodded. I know, tell me what they are. I exhaled slowly. No comments about my appearance. No advice about my career. No pretending the past didn't happen. Fair, he said quietly. And if I mess up? Then you try again. We both smiled then, a small, fragile truce blooming between us. When we stood to leave, he hesitated, then said, Dad and Derek might never come around. I know, I replied, and that's their choice to live with. Walking home afterward, I realized something I hadn't before. Forgiveness wasn't about erasing pain. It was about releasing the hold it had on me. Months later, a new envelope appeared in my mailbox. Not the heavy kind, lined with gold foil. This one was cream, handwritten, with small flowers drawn along the edge. Inside was an invitation. Emma Brooks and Thomas Wells invite you to celebrate their wedding. And a note. Diane, I want you there exactly as you are. Teal hair, tattoos, everything. You've always been braver than the rest of us. Love, M. I sat at my desk for a long time, tracing her handwriting. Emma was my youngest cousin, the quiet observer at family events, the one who used to sketch beside me in secret. Maybe she'd been watching all along. Are you going to go? Caleb asked that evening, slicing vegetables for dinner. I think so, I said. Not for forgiveness, for closure. He smiled. Then I'll be right beside you. 2 months later, we walked into that old stone church together. The air smelled of lilies and dust. I wore a simple navy dress that showed my ink, and Caleb held my hand as if anchoring me. People turned when we entered. Some smiled awkwardly, others whispered. Aunt Judith gasped. Uncle Robert nodded stiffly, but then I saw Emma rushing toward me, her wedding gown trailing like light. She hugged me fiercely. Thank you for coming, she whispered. It means everything. Her words cracked something open inside me. During the ceremony, I caught my mother watching from across the aisle. For a moment, her expression faltered, something like regret flickering before she looked away. She didn't approach me afterward, and I didn't need her to. Because when Lucas introduced me to Jenny, resting his hand gently on her pregnant belly, he said proudly, This is my sister, the artist. No hesitation, no apology. Driving home that night, Caleb reached across the console and took my hand. You did it, he said softly. Did what? Stopped running. I smiled. I guess I did. The next morning, I opened my journal and wrote, Family isn't DNA. It's the people who never ask you to shrink. 6 months later, Ember Ink Collective was thriving. 3 new artists had joined, each with their own story of reclamation. Every wall was covered in art from clients, proof that beauty could bloom from brokenness. We started a scholarship fund for art students estranged from their families. The first recipient, a shy 19-year-old named Ivy, cried when we handed her the check. She reminded me of myself, nervous, hungry, defiant. One evening, after closing, I sat in my chair and looked around the studio. Sunlight spilled across the floor, catching the glass jars of ink in a prism of color. I thought of the 12-year-old girl once banned from dinner for a streak of violet in her hair, and I smiled. The color they told me to wash out had become the life I built, every shade of it. When a new client walked in, a woman in her 50s, hair freshly cut short, she showed me a small design, a butterfly on her wrist. Her voice trembled. I don't know if I'm brave enough for this. I smiled, recognizing the fear. Have you ever had to choose between peace and approval? I asked. Her eyes met mine. Every day of my life. Then you're already brave enough, I said, preparing my tools. Let's begin. As the machine hummed to life, I realized the truth I'd been chasing all along. I hadn't lost a family. I'd created one scar, one color, one story at a time. And every line I inked from that day forward was a promise that no one's truth deserved to be hidden.